Imagine this. A man turns on the camera in the middle of the night and records his final message. He has a knife and a gun in his hands. His voice is calm, but what he says is chilling. Some of what I'm about to do will shock many people, but it's a necessity. Revenge is a necessity. Justice is a necessity. I can't go on like this. This man is 29-year-old Ricky Rodriguez. He was once seen as the prince of a cult called Children of God. From the moment he was born, he was expected to be a Christ-like figure who would save believers when the end of the world came. But now Ricky had turned into an executioner to settle scores with those who stole his childhood. His tragic end, killing a former cult member and then committing suicide, revealed the dark secrets of one of history's most perverse cults. In this video, we will explore step by step how the Children of God cult, which set out in the 1960s promising love and salvation, came to be associated with abuse, manipulation, and violence over the years. Get ready to witness every detail, from Ricky Rodriguez's striking story to the cult's founder David Berg's deviant teachings, to the divine prostitution network that spread across the globe, to the broken lives of those left behind. In 1968, an unusual preacher appeared in Huntington Beach, California, a hangout for hippie youth. David Berg was a former preacher who had been expelled from mainstream churches. He was determined to take the evangelical faith he had inherited from his family in a radical direction. David Berg started giving sermons in a coffee shop, forming a small community called Teens for Christ. He soon gathered around him young people who could be described as lost souls who had escaped society. In the shadow of the Vietnam War, these young people, disillusioned after the love letter, found solace in Berg's message. Berg promised them a revolutionary life devoted to Jesus, renouncing the world. At first glance, this movement, which would be called Children of God, seemed like a Christian commune mixing love, sharing, and social protest. Yet behind the scenes, a completely different reality was taking root. Berg's personal past foreshadowed the future direction of the sect. The son of a Methodist preacher, David Berg spent his childhood traveling with itinerant Bible preachers and became a preacher like his father in his youth. However, in the 1940s, he was fired from the church where he served due to his unorthodox teachings and allegations of sexual harassment against a church employee. Years later, when he established his own congregation in Huntington Beach, he was already prepared to challenge the moral codes of mainstream churches. Berg quickly became the sole authority for his young followers with his charismatic messianic prophet persona. He is referred to as Moses David, or Father, in his own words. He presented himself as the last prophet before the coming of Jesus. When this small community faced opposition from churches, they took to the road. Berg loaded his group of approximately 40 to 100 followers onto a bus and began touring the United States. When the media first noticed this unusual Christian caravan, they dubbed them the Children of God. The name stuck, and the sect was officially born. Berg and his followers tried to tell the world about Jesus through sermons, hymns, and protests. However, while this missionary work seemed innocent from the outside, Berg's extreme ideas were beginning to take shape within. At first glance, the Children of God sect appeared to be a Christian commune centered on the Bible. The sect's ideology and lifestyle took the free love movement of the 1960s to extremes under the guise of Christianity. Berg preached that the world would soon descend into chaos and that Jesus' second coming was imminent. He proclaimed himself to be God's chosen prophet for these end times. His followers believed that by breaking away from the outside world, what they called the system, and entering communal life, they would take their place in God's army against the approaching apocalypse. Berg went so far as to claim that one day God would give him and his wife the power to bring fire down from heaven. Cult members surrendered all their possessions and individual freedoms to the group. By the mid-1970s, a total of 120 communes, called colonies, had been established worldwide. In each one, members lived collectively, shared resources, and obeyed the sect leader's orders to the letter. Children, separated from their families, schools, and society, were educated only within the sect and grew up isolated from the outside world. Mainstream media, governments, and the school system were, according to Berg, the devil's order, meaning the system, and it was essential for followers to stay away from them. Daily life consisted of prayer, sermons, singing hymns in the streets, and collecting donations by distributing brochures. 90% of the money earned was sent to the center. Members lived on crumbs. The sect's most striking teaching was Berg's so-called law of love doctrine. Berg said, "God is love. Sexuality is a gift from God. Therefore, nothing done with love is a sin." In practice, this meant that all sexual acts were permissible. Adult members, whether married or single, were encouraged to engage in sexual relations with each other. Sharing your body with your brothers and sisters is sharing God's love, they were told. Furthermore, Berg had begun to sanctify all kinds of relationships, including incest, without any limits. Confessions and testimonies that he sexually abused his own daughter and grandchildren showed that he had taken this perverse belief to extremes. Berg's own granddaughter, Mary Berg, testified in a UK court case that her grandfather had abused her during her youth. According to Mary Berg's unbelievable claim, incest was acceptable because children learned sexuality from their families. Starting in the 1970s, Berg began writing letters to his followers almost every day. These thousands of letters, called more letters in the sense of Moses David's letters, were like the sect's holy books. They contained excerpts from the Bible, prophecies, dreams, guides to sexual relations, and even comic book-style pornographic depictions. In these writings, Berg urged unconditional obedience to herself. She condemned mainstream churches, capitalism, Jews, and even laws considered immoral. Yes, even laws prohibiting relationships with minors were obstacles to the satanic order in Berg's eyes. Cult members memorized and recited these letters. They were forced to unquestioningly embrace Berg's deviant ideas. Through these teachings, God's children quickly took on an identity that would spark major controversy. On the one hand, there was a group of young religious people talking about the Bible on the streets. On the other hand, there were sexual excesses behind closed doors. In the early 1970s, the cult began to spread outside the U.S. By 1972, more than 130 communes had been established, stretching from Europe to Latin America. Wherever they went, cult members distributed Bibles in different languages, sang songs to collect donations, and tried to attract the homeless and the destitute to the group. Young and vulnerable people were particularly targeted and invited to the cult's dormitories with the promise of a loving family environment. However, what awaited them in this family environment was a dark trap known as flirtatious fishing. By the mid-1970s, David Berg had developed an extremely unusual and dangerous method to expand his cult and gain new followers. According to him, true Christians should be fishers of men, like Jesus' disciples. He said this in reference to Jesus' words in the Bible, "I will make you fishers of men." Berg distorted this metaphor and called on his female followers to pursue prey using their sexual charms. This method, referred to in cult literature as flirty fishing, was essentially nothing more than spiritual sex work. Female members would flirt with foreign men, referred to as fish, in environments such as nightclubs, bars, and hotels. When necessary, they would sleep with them and win them over to Jesus. This would both recruit new members and secure donations or assistance from men. Years later, Berg's daughter Deborah Davis described this period as a worldwide prostitution ring. She said she could not have foreseen that her father's scandalous practices would cause problems for the cult. Indeed, it wasn't long before Children of God began to be referred to by the media as a sex cult. A 1974 report prepared by the New York Attorney General exposed the cult's methods. Using young women's bodies to obtain both sexual and material gifts from men, what Berg called sacrificing their bodies for Jesus, was presented as a religious ritual. The cult claimed to have reached thousands of people through this method. The numbers were truly staggering. From 1974 to 1987, cult members reported having sexual contact with more than 223,000 people. This was an incredible number. Hundreds of children were born as a result of these relationships. In cult literature, these children of unknown paternity were called baby Jesuses. The first baby born from a relationship with an outside man was actually from Berg's wife, Karen Zerby. The father of this baby was a waiter in the Canary Islands. Yes, The baby in question was none other than Ricky Rodriguez, but we'll get to his story in a moment. By the end of the 1970s, it was estimated that over 10,000 children had been born within the cult. While female members carried out spiritual missionary work, they also brought sexually transmitted diseases such as HIV/AIDS into the colony homes. As the AIDS epidemic grew in the mid-1980s, the sect was forced to yield to external pressure, and in 1987, Flirty Fishing was officially banned. However, even before it was banned, this fishing sect had tarnished its name and become the focus of a series of sexual abuse allegations. It could be said that the Flirty Fishing method was a form of prostitution between adults. However, the sexual abuse within the sect did not stop there. Berg's teachings on the law of love became perverted to include children. Adult followers were convinced that sexual sharing, including with their own children, was an expression of God's love. Dozens of former members would later reveal the abuse they suffered as children. A 1974 report by the New York Attorney General recounted, through the words of an informant, that sexual assault, imprisonment, kidnapping, and incest occurred within the sect. A young girl who ran away from home at age 14 and lived with God's children for a short time recounted being assaulted repeatedly over 9 days and, when she refused to comply with the demands of older brothers, being locked in a cell for days as punishment. One of the most famous names associated with the cult, actor River Phoenix, made headlines in a 1991 interview when he revealed that his first experience occurred at age 4 with a member of the cult. Another famous name, actress Rose McGowan, spent the first 9 years of her childhood in this cult, and, while her family fled to protect her from abuse, spoke of the cult's dark and strange sexual atmosphere. Cult leader David Berg tried to create a deviant utopia within the group as he cut off contact with the outside world. Adult men and women engaged in unlimited sexual relations with each other under the guise of love, while children were also swept up in this whirlwind. Berg wrote letters describing the abuse of minors, including his own children and stepchildren, arguing that it was God's will for young children to explore their sexuality. Nudity was encouraged in the sect's houses. Children were shown graphic material in comic book format. These horrific practices had become the norm within the sect by 1986. In 1986, as a result of increasing pressure, the sect's leadership passed a resolution stating that any contact with a minor would be grounds for expulsion from the sect. However, this belated ban did not change the fact that thousands of children's lives had already been ruined. The real reckoning would come from within the sect itself, leading to its collapse. One of the most shocking testimonies from within the sect came from Ricky Rodriguez, who was raised as the Prince of the Messiah himself. When Ricky was born in the Canary Islands in 1975, he was named Davidito, meaning Little David. His mother, Karen Zerby, also known as Queen Mother Maria David Berg, was the cult's female leader, and his father was a Spanish waiter whom the cult had seduced through flirt fishing. So Ricky was the first baby born from the cult's sacred sexuality, and that's why Berg claimed him as his spiritual son. Berg and Zerby raised Ricky from infancy as the cult's future leader, the heir to the prophecies. Little Ricky was the subject of a horrific experiment while still in swaddling clothes. The cult documented his growth process and distributed it as a handbook titled The Story of Davidito. This so-called childcare book described the explicit upbringing methods Ricky was subjected to when he was only 2 to 3 years old, accompanied by photographs. The nannies who cared for him were actually abusers. They photographed and documented the abuse they inflicted on him as lessons in love. This horrifying situation circulated within the cult. It was presented to parents as an exemplary educational model. Ricky Rodriguez traveled around the world with Berg and Zerby throughout his childhood. One might think he was raised in luxury, but the reality was quite different. Ricky was assaulted repeatedly throughout his childhood. His body and soul were left with irreparable wounds. Among the women who raised him, Angela Smith was the nanny who sexually assaulted Ricky when he was younger. When Ricky reached adolescence, he managed to escape in order to avoid further abuse by the cult and to live a normal life. He left the cult in the late 1990s, got married, and took a regular job in America. However, the traumas of his past did not leave him. He struggled to adapt to his new life. He struggled with depression and anger attacks. Abandoning the religion he believed in made him feel guilty. On the other hand, the desire to seek justice from those who stole his childhood gnawed at him. In January 2005, Ricky could no longer bear it and made a radical decision. He stepped in front of the camera and recorded a farewell video. In this video, he said that revenge was not a desire, but a necessity for him. He had to do it for justice. His eyes were filled with the thirst for revenge. He showed the gun he had loaded with bullets. He was determined to seek retribution for the childhood that had been stolen from him. Ricky's real target was to find his mother, Karen Zerby, and kill her. He couldn't find her, but he found the other person who had haunted his nightmares for years, Angela Smith. This woman, who had once been his nanny, became the first and only target in Ricky's bloody plan. On the night of January 8, 2005, Ricky invited Angela Smith to his home in Tucson, Arizona. Unaware that her former spiritual son intended to kill her, the woman came to the meeting. Ricky channeled years of anger into a single knife blow. He stabbed Angela Smith repeatedly. He then jumped into his car and drove off toward California. The next morning, on January 9, 2005, he shot himself in the head inside his car in the city of Blight, California. This murder committed by Ricky Rodriguez became a turning point in the history of the cult. Allegations of abuse, which had been discussed behind closed doors until that day, hit the world's agenda in their most tragic form. The media referred to Ricky with sensational terms such as former cult prince, murderer, and suicide bomber. The story of this young man, once hailed by cult members as the Son of Christ, horrified millions. Ricky's words in the video he left behind rang in their ears. How could they do this to children and then sleep at night? Indeed, those who had been doing this for years now had to wake up from their slumber. Following the incident, officials from the sect, then known as the Family International, issued a statement claiming that Ricky's experiences stemmed from past mistakes. They claimed that they had enforced strict rules to protect children since 1986, and that former members like Angela Smith were actually victims within the cult. However, these statements did not satisfy the public. A cult spokesperson's statement assessing Ricky's death drew even more backlash when he described former members as malicious individuals with an agenda to demonize the cult. Ricky's story was not unique. Countless former members corroborated similar stories and Berg's sick practices. Berg's own daughter, Deborah, had already left the cult in the 1980s and publicly exposed her father's perversions regarding incest and abuse. Even the family at the top of the cult had exposed the shattered truth. Ricky Rodriguez's tragedy became the voice of thousands of cult victims. Although his quest for revenge ended in the wrong way, he succeeded in drawing the world's attention to the dark legacy of God's children. Now, when the name of this sect was mentioned, it brought to mind not only Bible verses, but also cries of abuse and lives cut short. You may be wondering if this sect was never investigated over the years. The Children of God sect had been a topic of public debate since its early years. Although some newspapers in the United States followed it with curiosity under the headline, Messianic Hippies in the early 1970s, scandals soon came to light. In 1974, the New York State Attorney General's office published a comprehensive investigation report on the sect, explicitly labeling it a cult. This official report documented numerous allegations of crimes and stated that the FBI and Interpol were pursuing David Berg. Indeed, in 1993, Interpol scrutinized Berg's activities in Argentina. At the same time, the FBI launched an international investigation. Police raids were conducted on the sect's communes in various countries. For example, in 1992, news emerged that mass operations had been carried out in Australia and France to protect children, and dozens of children had been taken into state custody. In Argentina, some of Berg's followers were arrested. Hundreds of children were taken into protective custody. Berg hid during these raids and escaped justice. The media continued to closely monitor the cult. Although the Children of God changed their name to the family in the 1980s, newspapers still referred to them as the Old Children of God cult. Charon Zerbe, who took over the leadership after Berg's death, also maintained his mysterious image. Zerbe did not appear in public for years and did not give interviews. Even her whereabouts were kept secret. After Ricky's death in 2005, a reporter said, "We know where the Pope is, but no one knows where Charon Zerbe is. She doesn't even show up when her son commits suicide." In 2017, The Guardian obtained FBI documents through a Freedom of Information Act request, once again revealing the extent of the cult's past crimes. Public perception of the cult was now clear. The Children of God were one of the most marginal and dangerous cults in history. Leading cult-busting activists and cult experts began to mention this group alongside Jim Jones's People's Temple and Charles Manson's cult. In fact, for many, the Children of God were an even more extreme example than the others, particularly in terms of the scale of abuse. So, after so many scandals and disintegrations, what is the state of the Children of God cult today? Charon Zerbe, who took over leadership after David Berg's death in 1994, tried to keep the cult on its traditional path until the 2000s. In the mid-1990s, it was reported to still have 9,000 adult and 3,000 child members in 50 countries. However, the aftershocks could not be prevented. The Ricky Rodriguez case, in particular, sparked a major internal investigation. Young people who had been born and raised within the sect began leaving en masse in the early 2000s. Their parents' generation had devoted their lives to grand dreams, but what they inherited was trauma. Faced with this wave of departures, Zerbe and his new wife, Steve Kelly, made a radical move. In 2009, the cult leadership made an unexpected announcement to its followers. It stated that, contrary to what had been said for 10 years, the apocalypse was not imminent and that Jesus would not be coming back in the foreseeable future. This incredible backtracking was actually an attempt to hold on to the disintegrating community. By the early 2000s, many members were leaving the sect. Donations and new members were dwindling. The system was crumbling. During this transformation process, known as a reboot or restart, the sect abandoned almost all of its strict rules. Members were told that they were not obliged to live in communal houses, that they could send their children to school, and that they could take on jobs in the outside world, known as system jobs. The worldly life that had been condemned for decades was suddenly normalized. This situation was shocking for many followers. Some felt liberated. Others panicked because they had been left uneducated and without savings, having been told their entire lives that the world was ending. Michael Young, a former member interviewed by The Guardian, recounted how after leaving the cult, he made a living blowing up balloons in a restaurant and collecting tips, and how he was so flustered when someone asked him out that he couldn't even engage in worldly conversation. After the restart, the Family International redefined itself as an online community. In the 2010s, the cult effectively dismantled its hierarchical structure. Parents who once gave everything believing they would change the world eventually realized with pain that they had been part of a huge deception. No matter how much the sect's current representatives claim to have distanced themselves from the past, the stigma of being a sex cult will never be erased from them. David Berg's twisted teachings may no longer be openly defended, but the pain and lost childhoods he caused are etched into history. Ricky Rodriguez's question, staring into the camera, remains unanswered. How could you do this to your children and sleep at night? God's children dispersed, leaving behind a dark legacy. However, their story will continue to serve as a cautionary tale, urging us to remain vigilant against similar structures. We have reached the end of this video. See you next time. Take good care of yourselves.